Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for joining me today. I had the chance to watch You Won't Be Alone this morning, and I was really quite taken by it. I really appreciate, I really loved what I got out of the movie, and so I wanted to start and say thank you very much for coming up for being a part of something such a wonderful and unusual piece of filmmaking.
Thank you, Brian.
When uh what was it that drew you to making the movie, to coming on board to the movie?
I mean, when it came to me, I just got an email from Christina, the producer, and it was like, oh, described as a supernatural film about witches in 1800s Macedonia. I was like, oh, okay, witches, and then she kind of described it as Terrence Malick meets the witch. I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting, and and it was from Goran, who um, he had a short film at Sundance, which won Sundance, and then I watched the short. I was like, oh wow, this is an incredible filmmaker right here, and you know, it had the cast attached to it, the really great cast, and then obviously reading the script, I was like, I've never read anything like this before, like. Well, I think my first thing was like, how's this film being made? Like, because it's a film about 1800s witches in Macedonia, and it has all those kind of elements. You're like, oh, I've never quite seen this done in this way before. So I was pretty excited to speak with Goran, and obviously once I met with Goran, I was like, oh wow, this is a filmmaker who has a very strong point of view and wants to approach this in a way that's kind of quite daring. And I mean, the script itself was very daring.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the things that's so unique about this movie is the fact that yes, it is about witches, but to just say it's about witches, you're almost missing the point of the movie because it's
Exactly.
about something. I look at is I look at it as a film about connecting to life and learning about
Mm-hmm.
life. And after time being isolated, to a certain extent, you almost forget about the fact that there is this supernatural idea at the center of it. And what was it about your early conversations? What were some of the things that you guys talked about early on in your conversations when it came to how you were going to shoot this film?
I mean, you're right. Like as soon as I was reading, I was like, oh wow, this isn't. To me, it wasn't a horror film at all,
Mm,
and it definitely wasn't written like that. Like you said, it's very humanistic and insightful, and it was what was surprising about it. And then seeing Gone short film, I'm like, oh, I don't think he's gonna make this like a horror. Like this isn't a horror film to him either. Like,
yeah.
and obviously it's very apparent in the script. And speaking with Gone when we finally met, you got a sense that he was just like, yeah. It started out as like a writing exercise for him. It was like, oh, what if some of my favorite directors end up making a genre film on the surface as a genre film? How would they approach it? And
Hmm.
then he started writing this piece, and then he was like, he was more inspired by Virginia Woolf, and a little bit of Malick, and so he kind of wrote this, not thinking anyone would make it,
Hmm.
which is why I think it's so bold because he's not trying to second guess himself on a lot of things, and he's just writing it from how he was feeling. And his big regard is like this, it's really really grounded in Nevena, the witch, our young protagonist, and what she's gone through and her feelings about certain things, and you know by becoming different people, she really learns what it's like to be a human and to have empathy and have humanity. And, so, and then, we're obviously discussing it was like, going, was like, like I've never made a genre film. I've never written a genre film. This is the first time I've written anything that has elements of that. And we both agree. It was like, yeah, we don't see it as a genre film at all. There's obviously those elements, but we never saw it as approaching it in any of the visual tropes of what that might entail. For us, it was how do we make the audience believe in what's happening in this world, and that's really if they believe in the actors inhabiting this character and being immersed in the world. And so it all kind of was like, well, yeah, the performance is a key here, and how do we, how are our creative choices visually going to enhance that? And a lot of it comes down to the style for them to be able to move around within the space and to not stage anything too much, to allow the actors to have the freedom to be able to discover things and to not bog down in the technicalities so much or the mechanics of filmmaking. And through that, we discussed, Goran had done more of a fluid and handheld approach before in his previous films, and you kind of really got a sense of that naturalistic approach. But then it's like, well, how do we adapt that for this film? And then, we talked a lot about what the physicalities of these characters might be, because, reading it, you're like, oh, this young girl's lived in a cave this entire time and she can't talk. So she's never had any interaction within this world and she's never been outside of this cave. So everything's kind of new to her, and everything's, like, I was like, I've never seen this before. I've never seen this kind of behavior before, really. So I wasn't really quite sure how to shoot it. But we were discussing, what that could be like and what the ideas, what he had in mind, and, what I had, like some ideas I was pushing back and forth, and we're just discussing like the possibilities of, this could be an option, this could be an option. Maybe we, this is something that we could explore. But it was like all about exploring. And, one thing we did talk about was possibly having one of the actors come in early in pre-production, and we try some things out and see what feels right and what, just to try a lot of different ideas. And, like Sarah came in early, and we did try out a lot of this.
You mentioned Malik, and I definitely felt very much in kinship with like Tree of Life and A Hidden Life in some of his films, and the way the movie is shot. And that's one of the things I really liked about it. One of the other things that, I mean, I want to say it kind of sets this movie apart, but really kind of doesn't, because we're seeing more and more films go back to this, is the use of the standard aspect ratio. And when did that decision come into play when you guys were talking about the movie?
So that's an aspect ratio that I love, and that Goran himself has utilized quite a bit in his short films. So his short films have more of a 1:3:3 Academy aspect ratio. But then he was like, hey, what do you think of 1:4:4? I was like, 1:4:4? I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of like what IMAX uses. And we're like, oh, it's, not quite as square as 1:3:3, but it gives you a little bit more space, but it's also not quite super wide either, and we just had a discussion with there. I was like, I think it could kind of work. And, he wasn't quite sure if he could get a pass with a studio. That's why I was like, maybe 1:4:4 is like a good, it's not, maybe not as intense, but it's still very much a different ratio. And during our pre-production phase, I had a red Komodo and a set of lenses that I would just put in like a carry bag, and then everywhere we scouted, I would be shooting, like just staying alive, trying just to see what people were like within space. And then, a lot of that time was to see what we're getting with this ratio and how we could utilize this aspect ratio to, once again, capture what our lead character was feeling at that particular time. I mean, I was with Goran, and it was like, hey, I've been thinking about this, like having a lot of headroom. It was like, yeah, I think it could make her feel like small in this world, and maybe it's like all like, it's like too intense, and maybe she has a feeling where it's like, the space feels it's kind of like weighing down on her, or the environment's weighing, so we're just experimenting with that. I would line up a shot with someone standing in frame with Sarah quite a long time. And he was like, oh, let's try more headroom, more headroom. And I was like, oh, really? It's like quite unconventional. But then, like, we'll frame at the bottom of the frame. I was like that kind of headroom? He was like, oh, that's kind of. I was like, oh, wow, that's really like pushing the framing. And, then we'll try to go on the edge of frame and cutting off the edge of frame. And then, looking at that footage, I would kind of piece it together later on my own, and then just seeing that sequence of images, I was like, oh, you do gotta get a sense of feeling. It does make you feel a certain way mixed with, when it's composed with a series of images.
Mm-hmm.
And then, that was like a bit of a research process for us to figure out, what we could be doing on set.
Yeah. What are some of the benefits of shooting in that ratio as opposed to some of the other ones that we're more familiar with?
I think when we set out to do it, it was really, like I said, all our creative choices, all our visual creative choices when it comes to the camera and the lenses and everything came down to the performances. Mm-hmm. And that aspect ratio really, like as soon as we started framing things up, it really was there to work, to just for us to have a subjective approach to whatever the character was feeling. And that's kind of like what we always say. It wasn't really like, there was a her within that sense of space also, but it wasn't really too much about like the vistas or anything, because that's not the right ratio for that, because we're like, oh, mountain, there's landscapes and all this kind of stuff, but it was really about isolating her and making her either feel claustrophobic or on edge, or kind of like, like it's the abstract kind of like feeling for that. And as we were filming, like Goran would talk, it would be times he would just be giving actors direction, would give me direction, who would like, hey, go in, Matt, and then headroom will like sliver, which means like where I'd like put them on the side of it, like with the edge of frame. And it was always dictated with what that character was experiencing at that particular time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. With modern technology the way it is, how easy is it to get a natural look when you're doing so much shooting outdoors?
That's a very good question, because when we approached this film, we're shooting towards, like, it was coming into winter, and we're in a mountainside in a village. So I was thinking like we're gonna get cloudsy type, which would be nice for this kind of world. But yeah, it was free cold, but it ended up getting a lot of full sun. Mm-hmm. And then like for sun, I'm like, all right, we'll have to work out. We have to kind of figure it. Like we did a lot of like scouting with the time and what the sun position would be, because we knew we were going for quite a naturalistic approach. The sun direction is a big thing, because that's something we can't control, is the sun. But we can control at what time we shoot something. We'll try to, at least within the schedule, to utilize the sun's position to our advantage. And another thing, that the handheld approach was obviously for performers, actors were allowed to move where they wanted, but also I was lighting while I was operating the camera. So my position of the camera in relation to what they were doing, I was adjusting the lighting on them as they were acting. I was obviously capturing their performances, and my main priority in the framing and the composition that was her state of mind. But I was also looking at the lighting and adjusting the camera to where the sun was and lighting it while we were shooting in a way. And I was constantly changing the exposure. That would often be moving from inside to outside and then back inside. So I was constantly writing the iris for the exposure. And then, so yeah, it was a constant thing. And, like we had the Alexa Mini, which was really great when it comes to highlights, and the Cookspeed Pangos are these lenses from 20s to the 40s, depending on your particular lens. So it had like a painterly quality that we felt, we felt kind of like not only within the time, but it had certain like like a slight ethereal quality depending on how much we were flaring the lens as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because the lens does flare quite easily, and that kind of gives you a certain feeling if you flare it out a lot or flare it a little, or so once again, it was like all quite spontaneous decisions. We kind of knew what we could do within the space and the lighting. It was like adapting that spontaneously and instinctually when we're actually filming with the actors.
When you guys, I mean, you already mentioned a couple of inspirations earlier when you were talking about the visual style. Are there any filmmakers or any cinematographers that you look at in preparation for a film, or does it kind of vary from film to film, or do you even look at other films and you just kind of want to make sure that you're doing your job to try and make it unique as opposed to just going off of what other people do?
That's a very, very, very good question. And, in the past, when it comes to like commercial work or smaller kind of projects, you've been given like a whole bunch of references, like, hey, study this, study that. And, when it comes on, like, I always find it not as exciting if I'm just like following someone else, what someone else has done, like to the T or whatever, like that's not like copying someone is not something that I'm really that interested in. And the filmmakers that I do work with, they have certainly like inspirations and certainly like, they're like, oh, we've liked what we've done there, but they, you have to make it your own. Like, you really have to kind of make it your own. Like I said, like I remember reading Chivo talk about working with Terrence Malick on Tree of Life, and he was like, oh, this approach is like opened up to a certain way of filmmaking that I've never approached before. Like I've never seen it done this way. And I remember reading that thinking, oh wow, like they're just like, oh, so spontaneous to be able to like just go with whatever was happening on the day. And I thought that was inspiring. And I was like, oh, I wonder if I would work in that kind of way, But then I was also looking at Robbie Ryan's work with Andrea Arnold, and like Wuthering Heights was another film that I looked at, just more for like the landscape and the fact that it was period, but also, like it's quite similar. Like Andrea Arnold's doing very similar things in her own way. And once again, it's like the both of them are doing it for the sake of capturing something that doesn't feel staged and doesn't feel, they go on for something that feels very genuine and very real. And, with Goran, it was more of us like, like Goran knew the beats that he was kind of trying to reach for within the script, but he was really opening to trying to discover that on the day, because whatever we discovered, and that was a collaboration from everyone, to allow the actors and allow Goran to be able to find that. And then, as we started doing it, like we were doing things that we didn't think we didn't plan to do, but because we were finding them and discovering it, it felt so more compelling and tangible. And, for us, it was like, oh, wow, I think we'll do something here by shooting this kind of particular way. And, there's like the details within like the actual like technical side of things, like Terrence Malick, he uses like extremely wide lenses quite up close, and Goran was kind of more, like, I want to be in there. It's not really about her within the space, it's about her and what she's thinking. So we went the other route, which is more like longer lenses, like the 40 mil or 75 mil. It felt more internal than what they were doing. And, Andrea Arnold's camera's always either profile or following the characters, because that's very, very subjective. So the audience feels the events happening as the characters feel the events happening. And we were inspired by that as well. And once again, we took our own approach because our characters acting in ways that are very different. You know, it's quite unique in their approach. So we wanted to have these ideas that they've explored, but also the reason why those ideas are there and to adapt it for what our film putting. And I feel like, you know, with the way our performers were acting, we responded in a way that was truthful to what they were doing.
Okay. I just have one more quick question. Because of the fact that so much of what we hear on the soundtrack is voiceover, and so you don't really have a whole lot of, you have some dialogue carrying the narrative, but ultimately it's about the images. Does that change? How much does that change your approach as the cinematographer in your process of telling the story?
I think my process of doing that is like, once again, like it's really what the actors are doing within that space. And I do have to say, like Bethany Ryan, our production designer, she did an incredible job in setting up the environment and the space for the actors to really be immersed in, and to give them a lot of like details that they can respond to, and props, and just the physicality. And like, you know, Bethany Ryan did a really great job in that, because it was the entire world, which meant that the actors could move around a lot within that base, but also the camera was allowed to follow the actors. So it was all kind of like everyone's working together and everyone working on that to just build on, well, like I said, like something that felt genuine and believable and instinctually like alive. So it was like, you know, a lot of like, we did a lot of prep in what the spaces would look like visually and what the lighting was doing. But, you know, like I said, we come on the day and it's full sun, or there's like the field out there is like full of mist. So let's take advantage of that. Or, you know, we had so much to do, so much time, not so much to like compact within our shoot days, that we had to embrace what was given to us and to really go with that. And once again, like everything I was doing was in relation to what the actors were doing, and what exactly, and what that main character was feeling.
Okay, well, Matthew, thank you very much for your time today. And like I said, I really respond well to this film. I thought it was quite a unique experience, because I mean, you think about just the basic premise and you expect one thing and it's completely different. And so I want to thank you for your time and talking to me about it today.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for watching the film.